Welcome to the Biblical Eldership Podcast. Dave Anderson here with Alex Strauch. We are in chapter 21 of the new Biblical Eldership, Above Reproach as a Husband and a Father. Paul says to Titus, appoint elders in every town as I directed you. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Alex, this has to be one of the most technical chapters in the whole book. Why don't you just give the listeners a sort of a big picture summary of this chapter?
Yes, well, in our last time together, I picked up on the little phrase, as I directed you. That's very important. As I charged you, as I ordered you. In other words, Titus is to do this as Paul gives him exact, precise instruction. And then the first thing he says is, must be above reproach as a husband and above reproach as a father with his children. And the big controversy is over the word believers. Are they believers? They must be believing children, or does it mean faithful, trustworthy, dutiful children? That's a big debate, and it's been debated forever, it seems. Mm-hmm. And then in verse 7, you move to the singular overseer, which some people think that's a separate office, or it's the preacher among the elders. And then he gives this interesting phrase, God's steward. We're going to pick up on that. That's very, very instructive. Elders are God's stewards in God's household. So the big debate will be over husband of one wife, which we've already covered, and then the children. Does it mean believers or does it mean faithful children?
Well, let's get into it. We've already looked at and spent some time on what it means to be above reproach. And then, of course, Paul moves right into these qualifications of the elder's marital life and public reputation with his kids. We've, again, looked at husband of one wife, but let's talk about the children's standing. And this really is where a lot of friction comes, or debate, or questions. Talk to us about pistis, the word for faith, and how this applies to the elder's kids. What does it mean?
Well, just one point here, David, and that's the husband of one wife. In www.eldershipbook.com, I go into this very difficult phrase. There's a lot of disagreement on what it means. It's only 3 words in Greek. I give a full explanation of all the different views, then eliminate them, and I conclude with what many of our scholars are saying today. What Paul means by that little phrase, husband of one wife, is marital faithfulness. So if you want more material, go to that website.
And we did cover this in 1 Timothy 3,
yes,
verse 2, so you can refer back to that podcast.
Yes, and we conclude it marital faithfulness, and it doesn't go into all kinds of questions of divorce and remarriage or multiple wives.
So let's talk about these kids. Do they need to be believers, or do they have to just be faithful to their father?
Well, this has been a long-standing debate. The Greek word, it's a Greek adjective, pistos, and it's the word for believers. And the word can also just simply mean faithful, trustworthy, dutiful. And so the question is, what does Paul mean here? Is he making it a qualification that an elder must have born again, believing children, or is he saying something similar to 1 Timothy chapter 3, that they're submissive, they're not offensive, the man is above reproach in the guidance of his children?
So let's talk about both of these. Give us the argument for believers, and then let's look at the argument for faithful.
Well, the argument for believers is that this is a very common interpretation of the word. In many other places in the New Testament, we have this word pistos used of born-again believers in the Christian faith. A number of the translations follow this, like our English Standard Version, which we're using, and a number of others, NASB, NIV. So it's a very well-established view. However, I think with other translations, faithful, trustworthy, dutiful makes more sense. And the reason I say that is this. There are 3 ways I conclude this. One is the strong contrast between pistos children and profligate children. The contrast is very strong. It's between someone who is faithful, dutiful, and someone who is engaged in debauchery, insubordination. Debauchery and insubordination speak of wild, rebellious children who would be a disgrace and a heartache to any parents or any Christian community. These two words, and here's the key point, these two words contrast better with the idea of faithful, trustworthy, dutiful children rather than believing children. In other words, debauchery and insubordination are not synonymous with unbelievers.
Right.
And I would just go on to say, not all unsaved children, unbelieving children, this would be adults, are open to the charge of insubordination and debauchery. So you may have a child who is an unbeliever,
right?
But he's not a profligate. He's not a drunkard or a sexually promiscuous person or a drug addict. So I'm just saying that the contrast fits better with this wild, rebellious child and a faithful, a dutiful child who obeys mom and dad.
Another argument you give is that the 1 Timothy 3 passage would coalesce or correspond or match the meaning here in Titus, right?
Yes, it's a more parallel passage. And I would say that 1 Timothy 3:4 is the clearer passage. There's no debate over the children are submissive to the father with all dignity. So the clearer passage would help us understand the unclear passage. I would say that the Titus passage presents the same thought in a very positive way, where the 1 Timothy 3 is more of the negative way.
I've got some questions that and you list them in this chapter, but before I get there, any more comments on this before we get to sort of some difficult questions on this whole issue?
Yes, I think that's the third point I want to make, that if this passage is speaking of believing children, born again, Christian children, then you have a real problem. It raises all kinds of thorny questions about, are we responsible if our child is not a believer?
Right.
And what we have to see is that this could raise all kinds of hypocritical professions of faith. So any child who is 3, 4, 5 years old, they're going to profess the beliefs of their parents. The real question comes is when they're young adults, 18, 19, 20, and they go off to college, they go off to the service, they go off into business, and now they're on their own. This is a key moment when many expose themselves as unbelievers and they walk away from the faith. So at this point, is the father responsible if his children as young adults do not continue in the faith?
Yeah, it raises, like you mentioned, some thorny issues like even soteriology. I mean, I don't know anyone who would argue that a parent can, grant their kids saving faith. We can't save our kids, and so it seems like
What we do is prepare the soil for the seed of the Word of God. So the parents have a very big part in playing in the salvation of their children. Thankfully, I would say most Christian parents see their children go on and profess the faith. But there are godly, wonderful Christian parents that will have a child or two that in adulthood do not continue in the faith. And the point is this. It's an unreasonable demand that all your children are believers, because you cannot control that. That is something that God controls. But we do prepare their hearts and soil for when they hear the gospel, they believe. And by our example, we live the faith right in front of our children.
Right.
And that's one of the main reasons they continue, is they see reality in their parents. But you cannot guarantee that every one of your children will be a believer. So let me give an example. Here's a missionary of ours, and very, very excellent parents, 4 children, 3 are strong for the Lord today, and 1 has never really believed. And the missionary has said to me many times, why is it that my daughter does not believe? She's a wonderful daughter. She's not rebellious. She's not profligate. She's not like the prodigal son, but she does not believe in the faith. How do you explain that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you kind of answered some of these questions, but I think people will resonate with the questions you ask because they come up, they're common. Questions such as, should a man put off seeking eldership until all his children clearly profess faith in Christ and are baptized? You mentioned, what if 2 out of the 5 children do not believe or have yet not believed? Is he supposed to wait until all the children are believers? Does a profession of faith by a 3-year-old child count? Should an elder's children be required to become baptized believers, at a particular age? If a young kid professes faith in Christ and is mischievous, can we question if that kid has real saving faith? What if a father claims his children are all believers, but some people, maybe even some of the elders, doubt that? I mean, these are good questions. Any comments on this?
Well, the problem with interpreting this as believing children is that it raises all these thorny questions. If we translate this faithful, dutiful, these questions aren't even raised. And what we need to understand is this is an impossible demand upon a father. And remember this. Because your 18, 19, 20-year-old child is not a believer now, does not mean he may not be a believer at 25 or 30. So we have to not jump on the gun here and say, well, at 18, I know a church that says by 18, your children need to be saved and baptized. That's unreasonable. And that's reading too much into the passage. And so we need to be careful of, even the prodigal son, it appears, had a godly father, understood the ways of salvation,
right,
and received his prodigal son after he had gone through this debauched life. And then the real question comes about the other son, the elder brother, who was so harsh on his younger brother. Was he the saved one?
Well, you make a great point that it raises so many unnecessary questions. And I thought you made a good point that it can kind of force the father to want to potentially manipulate to get a profession. I mean, hey, there's a lot of pressure on this, and pressure on the kids. Listen, kids, if you don't get saved,
I can't be an elder.
Can't be an elder.
Oh, no, that's a very good point. And so we have these false professions. So
the question, a lot of the problems vanish or go away if we just interpret this in the same way we'd interpret the 1 Timothy 3:4. Any other comments on this, Alex?
Yes. Here's a very important comment. When you are assessing a man's qualifications and you're dealing with wife and children and family, it can get very sticky and tricky, and people can be very badly hurt. That's why if the congregation knows the person, the father, knows the family, they can make a better judgment than if someone comes into the church and you really don't know them and know the historical situation. It's very difficult to make a judgment. So this is why we don't lay hands on anyone suddenly. We want to know who they are. They need to be a part of the church for a while. And then we can make a better judgment about the children and the marriage and the family situation.
Well, we turn now to, I know, a super important part of the Titus section is an overseer as God's steward. So we've looked at must be above reproach. And then you've got this quote from Robert Yarborough, who says, if it was not already clear to Titus, Paul now reiterates this as an ironclad necessity. Got to be above reproach. And before we get into the stewardship aspect, let's talk about this. You highlight the connecting of verses 6 and 7. Paul uses the word we translate for. Talk about why that's significant.
Well, it's an inferential particle that shows the continuous logical connection in subjects between verses 6 and 7. So you have to go back to verse 5 and where Paul says, I want you to appoint elders, plural. He uses the word elders. He uses the plural word. Then here we have him switching to the singular overseers. So some people come and they say, well, undoubtedly, this is someone different than the elders. They might think it's someone over the elders, like you see in the 2nd century with Ignatius, where you have the overseer, then you have the elders, then you have the deacons, 3-tier office. Others say, no, he's an elder, but he's the preaching elder. The 4 tells us he is continuing the same subject. He simply switches to a different term.
It's a seamless transition from one to the other.
Well, if it isn't, it's a rather very awkward transition that doesn't seem to flow at all. And then he's going to use another term, steward. So we're going to get other terms for elders, which emphasizes, by the way, their function, their duties.
So what do you do with people who say, oh, these are different, I don't know if people argue for different offices, but different, Paul uses different words. He's talking about different duties, maybe different duties that elders have. Stewards do this, elders do this. They want to delineate or differentiate. How do you respond to that?
I would just say they're reading into the text what is not there. And that's why I emphasize the Greek construction of the little word for. I remember once talking to a great biblical scholar. I won't mention his name, but he was famous for his understanding of the Greek language and his commentaries on the Greek text. He said to me, watch out for those little words in the Greek language like gar, for, or therefore, or hence. You watch for those words. They're transitional, and they're words that follow the logic of the text. So here, very clearly, he uses the little word for, which is an inferential particle, which shows continuous logical connection in subject between verses 6 and 7. And that's what we need to do. Follow the text and not read into it maybe our own theology of church.
So I want to make an important point here, because even though he transitions from elders to overseer, and you're arguing what Paul's saying, he's not switching offices, I think it's really significant that people understand the different words do have different meanings, though. That there is something that each word, the elder carries an idea, overseer carries an idea, and we don't want to whitewash and just make it homogenous. So talk to us about the significance of understanding what each word means.
Yes, Paul's using these different terms to show us different aspects of the leadership role. So elder, as we've said before, shows wisdom, experience. Overseer shows superintendence, guardianship. So each emphasizes different aspects of the office. And so we do need both to see a full, rounded explanation of what we mean by eldership. Now, I want to make a point here about Benjamin Merkel's book, The Elder and Overseer, One Office in the Early Church. You can get that book through us at Biblical Eldership Resources, but it's an excellent book. It was his doctoral dissertation.
I was going to ask if this was his dissertation.
Well, the interesting thing is that he shows how important it is to understand there's one office with two different titles to that one office. Each title emphasizes a different aspect or work or position of that one office.
Alex mentioned, so Benjamin Merkel, very, very fine New Testament scholar.
Yes.
Mention this book again.
The Elder and the Overseer, One Office in the Early Church. And you can purchase that through our Biblical Eldership Resources. And Merkel points up just what you've been pointing up, that it's really important to understand it's one office, but you have these two different titles describing the same person. And it's important to understand that. If not, you wind up with the overseer being the senior person,
right,
and the elders being subordinate. That is not the teaching here.
Yeah, very, very good. Well, let's talk about the God's steward, as Paul says, he uses this word oikonomos, household manager, estate manager, administrator. You've got this great quote from Anthony Thistleton that I want to read, but talk to us about God's steward. What's significant here? What does this bring to the table?
Well, this is one of the great contributions of Titus. He mentions the elders, plural. Then he switches to the singular, overseer. And then he describes the overseer by a different term, steward. Now, that's a very, very important word. Maybe a modern translation would be administrator. And notice the word God's. He's God's administrator, God's steward. So, again, we're seeing the work of the elders. All elders are God's stewards, not the church's stewards, not the apostles' stewards. They're God's stewards. So this is a very important concept and word to add to our understanding of biblical eldership. Why don't you read that?
This is a very good quote.
Very good quote to understand what we're talking about.
So another very fine New Testament scholar, Anthony Thistleton, writes, this office normally included responsibility for overseeing a household budget, purchasing, accounts, resource allocation, collection of debts, and general running of the establishment, but only as instructed within guidelines agreed by the employer or the head of the house.
It's a wonderful quotation. You can find it in the book on page 222.
It's a man under authority.
A man under authority, but a man with authority. So there are two aspects to a steward. Number one is competency. And that's what Anthony Thistleton has pointed up here. Handles budget, handles people, allocates different aspects of the ministry. So you have to have competence. You don't want an incompetent steward. The second is trustworthiness. Someone you can trust. And there's a wonderful example in the book of Genesis with Joseph. And he's over Potiphar's house. And there's a statement in which the writer says that Joseph was in control of every aspect of Potiphar's household except his very food. And here's why this is important. Potiphar is the officer and head of the security forces of the Pharaoh. In other words, he's right next to Pharaoh, which would mean he would be a wealthy man with great status, and Joseph runs the whole household. Why? He was trustworthy and he was competent. Well, our elders need to be trustworthy men, and they need to have competency in administration.
You have this quote at the end of the chapter. E.F. Scott articulates Paul's logic, and Scott says, in an ordinary household, the most trusty servant was chosen as steward, and the same rule must obtain in the household of God.
Wonderful quote, yes. Now, again, if you don't understand the word steward, use the word administrator. That'd be a more modern one, or estate manager would be a good modern translation of that word. But what it tells us is the importance of the elder's job and his character. He must be a man of trustworthy character because he's over God's household. He's over God's people. And he must have a level of competency in leadership and administration of the things of God.
You know, Alex, for me, one of the things I take away from this chapter, and it is a little bit more technical, talking about the pistos, the faith of a child, but one of the things I love is with steward, elder, overseer, it paints a broader picture, a broader understanding of the office, that you don't just have, I mean, these three words, they really color in, fill in the blanks of what an overseer, elder, what the office is all about. And this word steward really augments that.
It's interesting that you don't find in other books much stated about this particular word, steward, administrator, but always add God's steward. Not much said in other books about pastoral work. And it's almost sort of like we have forgotten that Paul has said this. The overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. So it's really a very important statement that needs to be understood better and talked about more.
Alex, any closing thoughts on this chapter?
Well, it's a wonderful summary chapter of what Paul is meaning by his "as I directed you." His directions are elders must be in a faithful marital relationship. Their children must be children who are dutiful, trustworthy of the father's leadership in the home. Because he's an overseer and God's steward, this summarizes the importance of character and trustworthiness, because they have a very important job in the household of God, leading the Lord's people.
Biblical Eldership Resources is committed to equipping church elders to help them be effective, godly leaders of the church. Please consider donating to the ministry so that we can continue to provide essential eldership resources for church elders around the world. To donate, go to biblicaeldership.com.